Welcome everyone to Beyond the End of the World, the Mellon Sawyer Seminar at UC Santa Cruz, which comprises a 2-year-long research and exhibition project, including this public lecture series, bringing leading thinkers, visionary writers, and creative practitioners to campus. Today, we're joined by Melanie Yazzie and Nick Estes of the Red Nation in order to discuss both what lies beyond dystopian catastrophism, including beyond the wake of Trumpism's legacy of death and despair, and how we can cultivate radical futures of social justice and ecological flourishing, doing so on the basis of abolition, decolonization, and reparation, and even, as the Red Nation has recently proposed, with communism as the horizon and queer indigenous feminism the way. I'm TJ Demos of the Department of History of Art and Visual Culture and the director of the Center for Creative Ecologies. And I'd like to thank all my colleagues at UCSC, the Humanities Institute, and the Mellon Foundation for assistance in organizing today's event. I'd also like to thank my comrades in DSA Santa Cruz for sustenance and solidarity and collectively thinking through present political challenges, including the inspirational proposals of the Red Nation, with which we're in solidarity. My biggest thanks go to Melanie Yazzie and Nick Estes for joining us today, and also Chairman Valentin Lopez of the Amah Mutsun. Just a quick word on the Zoom interface. The closed captioning, if you're using that, just to let you know, is coming from an auto-generated system. So in other words, it's not completely reliable, I think. So please be aware of that. I'm speaking today from Santa Cruz, or rather the unceded territory of the Awaswas-speaking Upi tribe, where the Amah Mutsun tribal band, comprised of the descendants of indigenous people who have suffered so greatly under Spanish and US colonization, is today working hard to restore traditional stewardship practices on these lands and heal from historical trauma. To give sustenance to this and substance to this land acknowledgement, we've invited Chairman Valentin Lopez to welcome our guests and to speak about the current struggle to protect Yurastak, the sacred grounds of the Amah Mutsun, against the proposed Sargent Quarry gravel mining project. Such extractivism is but one local example of capitalism's appropriation of lands and water that's putting life at risk, and yet another instance of settler colonial transgression of indigenous territory and sovereignty, which calls out for solidarity and action, just the kind that the Red Nation writes about too in their proposal for the Red Deal, Indigenous Action to Save Our Earth, which has been a major inspiration to our Sawyer Seminar's thinking. We look forward to hearing more about it in what follows. I'm grateful to Chairman Lopez for his continued leadership in the struggle and for his generosity in joining us today. Following Chairman Lopez's welcome, we'll hear from Melanie and Nick, which I'm so excited about, as their writings as part of the Red Nation, their podcast, their movement building, and their scholarship, including Nick's book on Standing Rock, Our History is the Future, have been formative to the conceptualization of this series. This will be followed by a Q&A with Melanie and Nick and Mayanthi and myself. Mayanthi Fernando, my colleague, is joining us. She's an associate professor in the anthropology department and the current director of the Center for Cultural Studies here at UCSC. If you're in the audience, we welcome questions, and you should put those in the Q&A, and they will be delivered to us where we'll be able to ask the speakers. Thank you everyone in advance for attending, and I'd like to hand it over to Mayanthi now to provide more of an introduction to our speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, TJ, for that introduction, for starting us off. It's my pleasure to introduce Valentin Lopez, who has been the chairman of the Amah Mutsun tribal band since 2003. He's also a Native American advisor to the University of California Office of the President on issues relating to repatriation. Chairman Lopez is Mutsun, Awaswas, Chumash, and Yokuts. The Amah Mutsun is one of the 3 historic tribes that are recognized as Ohlone. They are comprised of the documented descendants of Indigenous people, as TJ said, taken to missions San Juan Bautista and Santa Cruz during Spanish colonization of the Central Coast. The Amah Mutsun tribal band, as TJ also said, is currently fighting a proposed mining project at Hirastack, their ancestral lands near Gilroy, and Chairman Lopez will tell us more about that struggle now. So Chairman Lopez, welcome.
Thank you very much, Mayanthi, for the introduction. And I want to first thank the Humanities Institute and the Center for Creative Ecologies for inviting me to speak here tonight. It's an honor and a pleasure to be speaking with both the speakers tonight, Nick Estes and Melanie Yazzie. This evening, we'll be telling truths, and these truths are difficult for some people to understand. And these truths have been denied, ignored, forgotten since the founding of these lands by not the founding, they didn't find them, since the takeover of these lands by the colonizers. The history of the Amah Mutsun and the Awaswas people on whose land UC Santa Cruz is on is a very difficult history. It was a history that is comprised of 3 brutal periods of colonization that included slavery, rape, genocide, the actual passing of state laws that called for the extermination of California Indians and the paying of bounty monies, the paying of militias to go out and hunt down the Indians and to kill them and pay bounty money for their scalps. And yet it is a shameful and embarrassing, but yet you look at the history books and none of that truths are told. It's denied. And the impact of that on the people for those 3 generations, 5, 6, 7 generations has been horrendous, just horrendous. Now it's time to find a path forward. But how do we find a path forward? How do we have honest relationships when these controlling institutions are not honest? They can't tell the true history of us. They can't be accountable for those actions and what happened. They want to give apologies that are just empty apologies. When I hear apologies, all I hear is, now will you shut up? You know, I apologize, so will you please shut up? That's what I hear with apologies. And then they want to talk about reconciliations. Reconciliation, there's no such thing for Native Americans. When you reconcile, it's like a couple, they're married and they want to, and they're in love and they're happy and they try to please each other as much as possible. But over time, that kindness and tenderness breaks down a little bit. And now they're bickering and stuff like that. They say, let's take our relationship back. Let's go back to the good times where we showed each other affection and love. And we took care of each other and we prayed together. That's when you reconcile, when you take it back to a good spot. But for Indigenous, but for California Indians and for Native Americans and all Indigenous people around the world, how can we ever reconcile going back to a time when times were good? They were never good. They were never good. Today we recognize that for us to have a path going forward, it must be, we must have healthy relationships. And we can only have healthy relationships when we deal with the past and what has happened. You know, we can't have a healthy relationship if they refuse to recognize that the land was stolen and now it's theirs. And Amah Mutsun are a landless tribe. They can't have an honest relationship with people that break treaties, continually break treaties. We can't have a good relationship when the truth can't be told, when things aren't right, whenever tribes cannot practice their spirituality and their culture. It is illegal today for the Amah Mutsun to have ceremony. When the California Indian, Native American religion was outlawed in the 1880s. All religious practices was outlawed. And then in 1978, Jimmy Carter passed the Native American Freedom of Religious Act that allowed, that once again, it made it legal to hold ceremonies. But that act was for federally recognized tribes only, not for unrecognized tribes. So whenever we hold ceremonies today, that is, our ceremonies are illegal. We want to find a path forward, but how do we find a path forward with unhealthy relationships? Another horrible example of an unhealthy relationship is when local governments allow the destruction of a Native American, of the most sacred site to a tribe. And that's what's happening today at Uristock. Uristock was the most sacred site of the Amah Mutsun people. It is located at the very bottom, southernmost end of the Santa Cruz Mountains. Is it at the southern end of the town of Gilroy. For thousands and thousands of years, our people held sacred ceremonies there. And people would come as far away as from Yosemite, from up the coast, hundreds of miles, from down south, hundreds of miles, to attend sacred ceremonies there at Uristock. It was a place of our spiritual leader, Kuk Soy, who lived in those mountains. And we would pray, and we would pray for balance in the four seasons, have balance in the world. We would pray for wildlife. We would pray for water. We would have prayers for healing, for renewal, etc. And there was those prayers that kept balance in our world. And then came a brutal, horrible time, the time of the California missions, and the time of the Mexican period, and then the American period. And our people were removed from those lands, and our people have not been on those lands for over 200 years. And then in 2015, there was a proposal to do sand and gravel mining on Uristock at the place of our most sacred site, at the place of our ceremonies. And the laws allow it. The laws allow that the mining of sand and gravel at this location. And our tribe is fighting that today. But as a federally unrecognized tribe, we're fighting it without money. And we're fighting it, well, I say all we have to fight this with is with tears and prayers. And that's what we do today. But we're also asking the local communities to help support us and to give overwhelming support to the denial of that permit, so that and put pressure on the boards of supervisors so that they will deny that permit. We look forward to the day that we can save Uristock from destruction. And we look forward to the day that we can return ceremonies to those people, so that we can start working on restoring the wellness of our tribe, and restoring our ceremonies and our prayers, and restoring health to our community and our identity and our self-esteem, and start looking for paths to form healthy relationships so that we can go forward with or without the perpetrators recognizing that they must heal. Today, we will only have relationships with institutions, people that are healthy. If they're going to not tell the truth about our of our history, they're going to continue to deny what happened to us. They're going to continue to deny land for the Amah Mutsun. They're going to continue to ignore that treaty that we signed in 1851, that the state of California sabotaged and was never approved. Then we're not interested in having relationships with them. We will find ways to go forward as a sovereign tribe. We will find the path forward ourselves. We do ask for people's support. And so we'd like to ask you to become aware of the Uristock campaign that we have, and to support it, and to support the protection of all cultural and sacred and sensitive sites to the Native people. And Let's find a path forward together. Oh, thank you very much.
Thank you, Chairman Lopez. Thank you so much for that really heartfelt statement. I now want to introduce Nick Estes and Melanie Yazzie, our featured speakers this evening. Nick Estes is a citizen of the Lower Brule Sioux tribe. He is an assistant professor in the American Studies Department at the University of New Mexico and a co-founder of the Red Nation, an Indigenous resistance organization. His research engages colonialism and global Indigenous histories with a focus on decolonization, oral history, US imperialism, environmental justice, anti-capitalism, and the Oceti Chekowing. He is the author of the phenomenal book, Our History is the Future, Standing Rock versus the Dakota Access Pipeline and the Long Tradition of Indigenous Resistance. If you don't have that book, go get it, go buy it, go read it. That was published in 2019. And he's also co-editor with Jeskier and Dillon of Standing with Standing Rock, Voices from the No Dapple Movement, which also came out in 2019. In addition to publishing in academic journals, Dr. Estes also writes for more public venues like The Intercept, Jacobin, and Indian Country Today. Melanie K. Yazzie, who is Diné, is assistant professor in the Department of Native American Studies and the Department of American Studies at the University of New Mexico, as well as national chair of the Red Nation. She does historical research at the intersections of Indigenous studies, feminist and queer studies, carceral studies, Diné or Navajo studies, and environmental studies. She is currently working on her first book, Life in the Age of Extraction, Diné History in a Biopolitical Register, and recently co-edited a special issue of Decolonization, Indigeneity, Education, and Society with Kacha Risling-Baldy on Indigenous water politics. Dr. Yazzie also does public intellectual and activist work on Native women's rights, LGBTQ2 rights, environmental justice, policing and incarceration, Indigenous housing justice, urban Indigenous issues, and international solidarity. Dr. Yazzie and Dr. Estes are co-authoring a forthcoming book from PM Press on border town violence with David Correa and Jennifer Nez Dinetdale. I came to know Dr. Yazzie and Dr. Estes, Nick and Melanie, when Melanie and I had writing fellowships together at the School for Advanced Research in Santa Fe a few years ago. And what I always find so remarkable about both of them is how completely they combine their intellectual and political work to the extent that they undo any distinction between thought and practice, scholarship and activism, mind and world. That is a rare feat. Also rare is the combination of intensity and laughter, fierceness and joy that they both embody. We are lucky to have them in our world and so lucky to have them here with us this afternoon. So please join me in welcoming Nick Estes and Melanie Yazzie.
Thank you so much, Mayanthi, for those words, and also to TJ Demos, as well as Chairman Lopez, for the introduction and the invitation. We're going to do something a little bit experimental, so bear with us, something we haven't tried. I don't know, I'll just give a brief introduction. That's a traditional greeting in Lakota. It's just, I welcome everyone with a handshake and an open heart.
Hi, I'll just follow up with Nick Yat, especially to my Diné relatives here. Melanie Yazzie Nishia. Bilagana Nishlem, I deshkijni bashes chin, Bilagana Dashachoro, Trotsoni Dashanala, Behalge, the White Cone, Arizona, de Nasha Akut Aldenenishle. It's really lovely to be here again. To echo what Nick said, I want to thank TJ and Mayanthi for this invitation. And I especially want to thank Chairman Lopez for your powerful words. You've provided a strong foundation for us, as Nick and I are definitely going to be doing some truth telling tonight from an Indigenous perspective. And we, encourage those listening to have an open heart and an open mind to receive these truths, however hard that they may be. As you said, Chairman Lopez, this kind of truth telling is part of our tradition of resistance. as Indigenous people, and it must be so, so that we can move forward into the future, which is the theme, right, of the Sawyer seminar. So what we're going to be doing tonight is Nick and I have taken passages from 2 books that will be coming out in March and April, so in just a few months, that we co-authored with several other comrades and colleagues. Mayanthi mentioned the first one. It's our book on border town violence coming out with PM Press, which will be out in March. Nick will be reading passages from that, and we're going to weave that into passages from The Red Deal, which is coming out in April with our imprint. We actually started an imprint called Red Media with Common Notions, which is another independent sort of leftist radical press. And so hopefully we'll see some themes arise, and hopefully it will go smoothly. And we look forward to being in conversation with folks. Thank you. Take it away, Nick.
"29-year-old Zachary Bearheels, a citizen of the Rosebud Sioux tribe, needed to see his mother. He left his aunt's house on the Rosebud Reservation where he'd been staying and boarded a Greyhound bus in Murdo, South Dakota on June 3rd, 2017, bound for his mom's home in Oklahoma City. He never reached her. The bus pulled into Omaha, Nebraska late on a Saturday night. Bearheels, like most passengers, got off the bus to look for food or maybe a clean bathroom. While he was gone, another passenger complained to the driver that Bearheels was strange, his behavior erratic. The driver refused to let him back on the bus when he returned. Bearheels suffered from bipolar disorder and schizoaffective disorder and required antipsychotic medication to control his symptoms and stay well. He'd run out of medication and his symptoms returned. Abandoned in Omaha without money or medication, Bearheels spent the night walking across the unfamiliar city. He walked past two of its hospitals and dozens of its churches. He walked past the Jocelyn Art Museum, famous for its native-themed architecture and its collection chronicling European conquest in North America. When the bus arrived in Oklahoma City without him, Bearheels' mother, Renita Chalapa, filed a missing persons report. Bearheels walked all day and into the next. Sometime after midnight on June 5th, he made it to a gas station and convenience store miles from where he'd started, exhausted, dehydrated, and hallucinating. A store clerk found him licking the windows of the store and dancing on the sidewalk in the dark. The clerk called the police and 2 cops arrived, Jennifer Strudel and Michaela Mead. They handcuffed Bearheels and placed him in the back of Strudel's cruiser. They ran a record check and saw he'd been reported missing. Strudel called Bearheels' mother at 1 a.m. Chalapa was up, so worried about her son that she hadn't slept at all. She explained to Strudel that she was ready to drive to Omaha, but needed to know her son was somewhere safe. He didn't have his medication, she said, and he needed help. Please bring him somewhere safe, she pleaded, and suggested a crisis center if possible. Strudel radioed her supervisor, Sergeant Eric Forehead, who refused Chalapa's request. Take him back to the bus station, he ordered. Just then, another cop, Scotty Payne, arrived. He pulled into the convenience store lot just as Strudel was opening the cruiser door to talk to Bearheels. But Bearheels was having none of it. He slipped past her and out of the cruiser, his hands still cuffed behind his back. The 3 officers chased him. A 4th cop, Ryan McClarty, arrived just as the others grabbed Bearheels and pinned him against a bottled water display on the sidewalk outside the store. McClarty grabs Bearheels roughly by his ponytail, while other officers push him toward the cruiser. Bearheels isn't fighting back, but he struggles to get his hands off of him. As they approach the open cruiser door, walking toward the security camera, Bearheels drops to the ground, his hands still cuffed behind his back. The officers circle him. Scotty Payne yells, "Taser, taser," and fires at Bearheels. The violent jolt of electricity knocks Bearheels onto his back. Only his legs and torso are visible in the security camera footage. He lays momentarily still, breathing heavily, gasping for air. What looks like convulsions begin but it's more likely the electricity coursing through his body. Payne stands over Bare Heels, holding the taser, pulling the trigger every few seconds. He writhes on the ground, kicking at him with his unlaced high-top sneakers. It's unclear if Bare Heels is trying to fight Payne off or simply convulsing. Suddenly, McClarty lunges toward Bare Heels and grabs him again by the hair. After he lifts him off the ground and slams him down, driving his body into the pavement. "You're gonna get it," Payne hollers. In the violence of the attack, Bare Heels slips his cuffs and his right hand comes free. He frantically tries to defend himself against McClarty, but the cop spins him on his back and pins him to the pavement. With his left hand, McClarty holds Bare Heels down, and with his right, he unleashes a flurry of punches up to Bare Heels' head. These are vicious punches, shocking in their force and efficiency. McClarty throws 13 punches in 8 seconds, each directly to the head. Each punch sends Bare Heels' head snapping back onto the pavement. Punch, pavement, repeat. The other officers stand over Bare Heels, watching and doing nothing. As McClarty kills Bare Heels, a woman's cries are heard in the background. Bare Heels says, "I can't fucking breathe," and then goes limp. The other officers continue to throw Bare Heels around while Payne radios for a rescue squad. The police place handcuffs on Bare Heels' limp arms and put flex cuffs on legs no longer kicking. Paramedics arrive. They find no pulse. He's not breathing. They bring him to a hospital, one that he just walked past hours earlier, where doctors pronounce him dead. The coroner's report determines that Bare Heels died from excited delirium syndrome, despite the fact that there is no such thing as excited delirium syndrome. Neither the American Medical Association nor the American Psychiatric Association recognizes it as a legitimate medical condition. It is a euphemism that coroners use for people that kill police with their tasers or in chokeholds. Omaha Police Chief Todd Schmader-Rear fires Payne, McClarty, Strudel, and Meade. Payne and McClarty are charged with assault, but a jury acquits Payne, and prosecutors later drop misdemeanor assault charges on McClarty. Police experts convinced the prosecutors that McClarty was justified in punching Bare Heels. When Bare Heels slipped his cuffs, they explained, he posed a threat, and McClarty was justified in eliminating that threat. Apparently, handcuffs, the most common of carceral tools, are a lethal weapon when not in the hands of cops. In April 2020, an arbitration panel holds Payne's termination, but reinstates McClarty, along with Strudel and Meade. They receive back pay, but are required to take a quote-unquote refresher course in policing.
There is something about the weather. Last year, bushfires in Australia scorched 46 million acres, an area larger than Hungary and Portugal combined. Flames shot nearly a half mile in the air, killing 34 humans and more than 1 billion animals. In the United States, over 8 million acres burned, killing 37 people and displacing countless others. Swarms of locusts darkened the sky in parts of East Africa and West Asia, devouring plants and fruits as they tore through the land, leaving hardly a scrap of green behind. A single living swarm in Kenya amassed to a size 3 times larger than New York City. Tens of millions of people across the globe faced increased food insecurity. The weather was also peculiar in 2019. There were fever-pitched days of revolt in parts of Latin America and the Caribbean. Indigenous people came down from the mountains and forests, blockading capital cities. What felt like a strong breeze in Peru, Chile, Ecuador, Argentina, Honduras, Haiti, and Bolivia was forecasted by some to escalate into a Bolivarian hurricane, a swirling storm of backlash against the failures of neoliberalism. In the evenings, the winds were brutally brisk. The nights were filled with terror and the grieving wails of the families of the youth slain by sniper bullets, blinded by projectiles, and beaten with police truncheons. The winds seemed to be blowing towards bloody reactionary violence. In autumn 2019, a military coup backed by the United States deposed Bolivia's first indigenous president, Evo Morales. His vice president, Alvaro Garcia Linera, described the mood of his country as a forecast for the entire hemisphere. Like a thick night fog, hatred rages through the neighborhoods of Bolivia's traditional urban middle classes. Their eyes are brimming with anger. They don't shout, they spit. They don't make appeals, they impose their will. Their chants are neither hopeful nor fraternal, but they ring with discrimination and contempt for Indians. They mount their motorcycles and saddle up in their SUVs, band together with their buddies from the fraternities and private universities, and set off hunting for the rebellious Indians who dared snatch power from their hands. Our Red Nation Quechua comrade and relative, Maya Ashjura Chipana, told us that fear had gripped her people, Indigenous Bolivians, as Huipalas, the symbols of Pachamama, the Indigenous Andean Mother Earth, were burned in public. It's like if they burned something sacred, like a little piece of your heart, Maya's father, Juan Lazaro, told her. We refuse to be burned, Maya told us. We know the stakes of our struggle. The horsemen of the apocalypse can't ride without a plague. The COVID-19 pandemic has swept across the globe, sharpening two competing visions of humanity, one based on science and caretaking, and the other on pure make-believe. The most powerful nation in the world chose the latter. Across the United States, Black, Brown, Indigenous, migrant, and poor people have borne the brunt of the virus. Even tepid social reforms like universal health care, largely a reality for other nations of the global north, was off the table. Instead, hundreds of thousands of people needlessly died, oftentimes alone, without access to life-saving medications or treatments available to the super rich. A large part of humanity perished, taking little pieces of our hearts with them. Others who either survived the virus's symptoms or lost their jobs or homes, or all three, were left to fend for themselves as billionaires raked in record earnings. In places like the Navajo Nation, rates of infection were exacerbated by centuries of resource colonialism, which has hobbled the Navajo economy, making it utterly dependent upon a dying industry that leaves nothing but poison and broken communities in its wake. While its rivers have been diverted to water golf courses in Phoenix, and its mesas mined for coal to power the southwestern US, about 30% of its population lives without running water and 10% without electricity. Grandmothers who have been hauling water for 90 years live next to fracking rigs that pump millions of gallons of fresh water into the ground to crack it open for access to oil and gas, destroying the water and the land in the process. In Indian country, tribes that took the science of COVID-19 transmission seriously closed their borders and set up emergency health protections, all while being treated by white elites in reservation border towns as contaminants in need of quarantine. Yet the make-believe approach won over most white settlers and their leaders. Once it was revealed that the virus disproportionately impacted non-white communities, heavily armed men, most of whom were white, stormed state capitals demanding haircuts and the reopening of restaurants. Others trespassed onto native lands for vacations and outdoor adventures. As the virus intensified and spread, so did a toxic atmosphere of cynicism and hatred. Settlers found new ground to go wild. 2020 has been one of the hottest years on record, but as Maya said, with our hearts in our hand, we refuse to be burned. A different kind of storm has been gathering. When the military forced Evo Morales from office in November 2019, he gave a speech. "We will come back," he said, quoting the 18th century Indigenous resistance leader Tupac Katari, "and we will be millions." Not only had the coup government with the support of the United States overthrown Morales's administration, they also tried to crush the project for decolonization that it represented. When Morales returned, the social movements that had given rise to his administration blockaded the roads surrounding the major cities, effectively shutting down the economy. Millions forced the coup government to concede, and the movement towards socialism was overwhelmingly reelected into power during the October 2020 general election. On November 9th, Evo returned. With him, and the election of Luis Arce as president and David Choquehuanca as vice president, the Indigenous revolution continues. The weather is changing and so are the stakes. Everyone feels the temperature rising.
A month later, in May 2020, after the three of the four cops who killed Zachary Bearkills, now Indian killers, are reinstated as officers, 4 Minneapolis cops murdered George Floyd. There is no flurry of punches as with Bare Heels. Derek Chauvin pressed his knee into the back of George Floyd's neck. One cop tells Chauvin, "I'm worried about excited delirium or whatever." He asks if they should turn Floyd on his side. "That's why we have him on his stomach," Chauvin responds. "I can't breathe," gasps Floyd. Like with Bare Heels, all of this is captured on video, and millions of people eventually watch as police slowly choke the life from Floyd while he cries out for his mother. As in Bare Heels' case, the initial medical examiner's report says nothing about police violence. No physical findings supported diagnosis of traumatic asphyxia or strangulation, the report first read. It is, quote, underlying health conditions, not the racial animus and white supremacy at the heart of American policing that killed Floyd. Is this the definition of excited delirium? The slow grinding down of bodies, hearts, and minds of Native, Black, Brown, and poor people by police? It is not enough to say that police killed Bare Heels or Floyd, nor is it enough to focus on the particular sadism of Payne, McClarty, and Chauvin. Rather, our task is to ask how we might account for their deaths, understood as a product of a murderous system built on Native extermination and anti-Blackness, a system designed to lead directly to premature Native and Black deaths. This is the quotidian nature of white supremacy, the everydayness of genocide, and it reaches deep into Native and Black lives, breaking hearts, shattering minds, and destroying bodies. These are the pre-existing conditions for millions. The murder of George Floyd sparked ferocious, organized, and principled movements for Black lives in a historical force unseen in generations. Countless, many have tirelessly organized for years against police and murderous system of white supremacy. They were ready for this moment because this moment is every moment. Millions took to the streets to direct righteous anger at the institution of policing itself. The aftershocks of these seismic ruptures toppled monuments of Confederate generals, Spanish conquistadors, and racist sports mascots. Decolonization and abolition are not mutually exclusive. Elites and nearly all elected officials, as expected, have scoffed at or patronized these Black and Native-led uprisings, condemning and vilifying those taking to the streets. Why do people burn down their own neighborhoods, they ask? Because they have never been their neighborhoods. US cities have never belonged to Black people. The end of chattel slavery offered no end to white supremacy. The plantation system continued on in the form of Jim Crow and in a ruthlessly policed racial apartheid organized around the theft of Black wealth. Black people were no longer the property of white overlords, but race relations between Black and white have always been and remain a property relation. Police are the enforcers of this relation, patrolling Black people as the plantation overseers once did, making, upholding, and defending racialized property relations. The geography of the United States is a geography of white supremacy. The Jim Crow sundown towns and the property redlining that reinforced it. A geography of freedom that excludes Black people from owning homes and land and of possessing collective social wealth. It is this history that kindled the fires that erupted in cities throughout the United States following the murder of George Floyd. You can't burn down your own neighborhood if it never belonged to you. It belonged to police, so we set it on fire. What burned was not Black property, but white property, the property of the owning classes, their chain stores, payday loan centers, fast food chains, slumlord buildings, and banks. By burning down the police stations that patrol the plantation, people burned down the plantation. The fires burned brick and mortar, but the target was a different form of property, what legal scholar Cheryl Harris called whiteness as property. Whiteness is not a thing but a property relation based on an exclusion ruthlessly enforced by the state. How could it be anything other in the United States than the social and spatial expression of a homicidal settler worldview constructed through cultural, legal, and political norms of extermination and genocide? The masses in the street broke the spell of inviolability surrounding the plantation to teach us that whiteness burns too. The plantation is where capital was first amassed from the forced labor of enslaved African people on the stolen lands of Native people. Expropriating the wealth based on forced labor and stolen land requires an astonishing commitment to collective colonial violence. This commitment fueled westward expansion. The settlers dragged the relations of the plantation along with them as they raped and murdered their way through native lands. It took more than temporary settler outposts to sustain this commitment to violence. And so these outposts developed into towns and cities. This is what settlers meant when they talked of bringing quote unquote civilization, as they liked to say, to their western frontier. We call all of this the border town. Settler colonialism has transformed the world we live in, that few settlers see their cities as spatial expressions of settler violence. The word instead took on other meanings. The border town most commonly described in the cities and towns along recognized international borders, such as the US-Mexico border. These are considered the borders that matter in the everyday life of a settler. We draw on native vernacular, an everyday language of resistance, to recognize the borders that settlers ignore. These borders exist everywhere settler order confronts native order. And since we find this confrontation everywhere in settler society, everything in a settler world is a border, and every settler is haunted by this border. A native presence that should not exist, that blurs the edges of settler ontology. The fundamental contradiction compels settlers to act like settlers. They sense the threat, but cannot name it. They are always on the defensive. The border town typically refers to white-dominated settlements that ring Indian reservations and give spatial form to the violence and exploitation that defines everyday native life, past and present. The border town is a cruel invention that imposes on native people a million daily indignities. The border town, however, is not just a place. It is a relation where the contradictions of settler colonialism emerge and show themselves to all. The constant crossing of borders is everywhere. The spatial transitions of off and on reservation, the moving across international boundaries, the skipping into and out of jurisdictions, and the knowledge that every native step constitutes a transgression of a settler border and a settler rule. Off the reservation is a political and military expression designating someone who is uncontrollable and therefore a threat to power. Originally, the term off the reservation meant a particular kind of outlaw, a native person who crossed the territorial boundary called a reserve or reservation, set by the United States or state government, writes Laguna Pueblo feminist Paula Gunn Allen. The reservation, more prison than homeland, offers no refuge from this settler geography. According to Gunn Allen, the boundaries also include imposed political and heteronormative norms, the strictly enforced divisions of territory, race, gender, and nation. A transgression of these cruel fictions going off the reservation made one a renegade, an outlaw, one who could be hunted down and usually executed. Many reservations began as prisoner of war or concentration camps, and some remain so. Settler law allows native peoples to call these homelands, but only until settler law says they can't. There's only the expression of the settler project: borders, violence, police. Every settler town is a border town because every native person on land that the settler desires, whether in a city or on the reservation, represents and embodies the active ongoing failure of the settler project. Border town is the word that describes the murderous colonial condition that has come to structure native life and thus native resistance to overturn that order. The only way to resolve this fundamental contradiction is through native liberation.
We should be mindful of the pitfalls of New Deals. The deal in US President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal was, after all, between Northern industrialists and Southern racists to save capitalism from itself during the Great Depression. It was hardly a people's deal, though it benefited workers and provided necessary relief. For Indigenous people came an Indian New Deal, as it was known, which itself had mixed results. Today's Green New Deal offers a real chance at galvanizing popular support. While anti-capitalist in spirit and paying lip service to decolonization, it must go further, and so too must the movements that support it. This is why the Red Nation initiated the Red Deal in 2019, focusing on Indigenous treaty rights, land restoration, sovereignty, self-determination, decolonization, and liberation. We don't envision the Red Deal as a counter-program to the Green New Deal, but rather going beyond it. The Green New Deal has the potential to connect every social justice struggle, free housing, free healthcare, free education, and green jobs, to climate change. Likewise, the Red Deal places anti-capitalism and decolonization as central to each social justice struggle, as well as climate change. It is red because it prioritizes Indigenous liberation and a left orientation to movement building and political struggle. The necessity of such a program is grounded in both the history and future of this land, and it entails the radical transformation of all social relations between humans and the earth. However, the spirit of these times is frequently forgotten. Freedom for some is unfreedom for others, and equality feels like oppression for the ruling classes who are being forced to reckon with decolonization. The legacy of the New Deal, which required the plundering of Indigenous lands to keep a settler economy afloat, cannot be the plan for the rest of the planet. Nations of the global South cannot follow the same path of development as the North in their pursuit of climate equity, because the atmosphere has become colonized, disallowing the path for industrialization and development the global North has followed. The unequal distribution of power and suffering is literally in the molecules we breathe and drink. The burden of transition lays at the feet of those most responsible for carbon emission-driven climate change, not those most imperiled by it. The energy consumption of the global North, especially in the United States and Europe, has to be radically curtailed, not subsidized by more green energy. The amounts of resource extraction to facilitate this transition, such as the acquisition of lithium for rechargeable batteries, will come at the expense of other nations who have been historically denied the technology to develop their own resources for the benefit of their own people. The United States, more than any other country, owes a huge share of the climate debt that should be paid, taken from the massive surplus of resources used to militarize the planet and stockpile nuclear weapons, to help the nations of the global South develop sustainably and according to their own values and processes. The most radical appraisals of the Green New Deal come from Indigenous people. According to the Indigenous Environmental Network, the Green New Deal, as is, will leave incentives by industries and governments to continue causing harm to Indigenous communities. Before endorsing the Green New Deal, IEN called for a clear commitment to keep fossil fuels in the ground, reject carbon pricing schemes, strengthen the language on Indigenous peoples, and stop, not prolong, our current exploitative and abusive economic and political systems. A complete moratorium on all new fossil fuel extraction, a long-standing demand by Indigenous environmental organizations to keep it in the ground, would cause a ruling class rebellion, which we're already seeing. The 100 companies responsible for 70% of global emissions, those relentlessly searching for hydrocarbon frontiers, market-driven fixes, and green energy booms, aren't going to put themselves out of business, nor will the ruling elite put their own system up for debate. The best forms of environmental policy come from the bottom up, and momentous change only happens with the might of a people's movement behind it. In North America, change begins with the land, one of the primary sources of both wealth and inequality. As Diné Whitaker from the Colville Confederated Tribes argues in her book, As Long as Grass Grows, settler state conservation policies stem from protecting, quote unquote, protecting slivers of nature by killing and removing Indigenous peoples from the land to create nature preserves, national and state parks, and public lands. But private land ownership has been equally devastating. The Homestead Act of 1862 carved up 270 million acres of Indigenous territory for white settlers. The invaders pulverized buffalo skulls into fertilizer for their plots, the sacred animals slaughtered by the millions to near extinction to starve Indigenous peoples off the land. Once cleared and settled, homesteading produced wealth for generations of white settlers, while Black, Native, and non-white people were categorically excluded. Today, white settlers own 96% of all agricultural lands and 98% of privately owned land in the United States. In 1970, Vine Deloria Jr. candidly spelled out the problem and even suggested a solution to North American settlers. He said, It just seems to a lot of Indians that this continent was a lot better off when we were running it, he wrote in the New York Times. Perhaps liberal-minded readers of that era thought it was a clever wordplay, the posturing of a red power militant, attention-grabbing sloganeering, but not a serious political demand. To the original people of this land, however, it was truth and prophecy. No society can ever have an ethical relationship to a place it stole. And today, Deloria's words sound more like rational environmental policy than militant jargon when compared to what's been on offer. A drive it like you stole it mentality, or more accurately, a live on it like you stole it attitude.
Border towns, as with all imperial borders, are spatial expressions of an intent to murder. This is why from Saskatoon to Santa Fe, border towns are always bloody killing fields. Omaha and Minneapolis, two border towns whose settler names are taken from the language of the native nations from whom they were stolen, are united by a settler violence, so deeply embedded in everyday life as to achieve a kind of banality in its regularity. It is so common, this violence, that it seems to disappear into the air that the settler breathes. Omaha and Minneapolis, like all border towns, were carved from what settlers called the frontier. You find the frontier, according to historian Frederick Jackson Turner, at the meeting point between savagery and civilization. Consider the phrase in the speech Turner gave during the 1893 World Columbian Exposition in Chicago titled "The Significance of the Frontier in American History." His meeting point served as a metaphor to describe the United States finally and fully emerged. In other words, this place the settler calls the United States cannot exist outside the settler domination of native lands. Another word for meeting point is border town, where the settler confronted and sought to destroy a native world in order to become the United States, in order to individually become American. Police use the exact same language. Police call the meeting point the thin blue line between two antagonistic social worlds. Like Turner, police understand the meeting point as the line between civilization and savagery. The thin blue line updates Turner's frontier thesis. For Turner, the meeting point served as a metaphor to describe an event, the conquest of native lands. The thin blue line makes clear that this was no event. It is an ongoing practice. Thus, the United States requires genocidal violence as long as a native world persists. Police use the thin blue line to remind us that this imperial project is a police project. Without police or without the settler, there would be no United States. So settlers and their police occupy these meeting places, the Omahas and Minneapolises, the well springs of the United States, and progress, these upside down places. They are upside down for the way the border town makes police violence look like self-defense, and a defense of civilization necessary to protect settlers from the savage threat of native retribution.
The pandemic all but erased how the Wet'suwet'en Nation stood up to Canada and Coastal GasLink pipeline in early January 2020, kicking off a year of intense resistance. In February, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police removed Wet'suwet'en and Gitxsan matriarchs from the Unistoten camp by force. Police raided a healing center, reconnecting Indigenous people to the land to help reverse the psychological and spiritual effects of ongoing genocide. Armed men forced their way through rows of red dresses set up by land defenders to honor the Indigenous women and girls who have gone missing or have been murdered on Canada's infamous Highway 16, the Highway of Tears in so-called British Columbia. The cops ignored the dresses, just like they've ignored the ongoing genocide against women and girls. What mattered to them was their historic duty, to clear Indigenous people from their land and make way for business. The Unistoten camp, whose motto was heal the people, heal the land, stood in the way of the extractive economic giant that is Canada, a nation that has undergone a public process of truth and reconciliation with First Nations peoples. The Wet'suwet'en matriarchs boldly declared, reconciliation is dead, and called for a shutdown of the Canadian economy. Indigenous peoples blockaded key railways across the country under the banner reconciliation is dead. Nearly $500 million worth of goods sat idly for several weeks in February, disrupting supply chains and slowly bleeding the Canadian economy. It was the only language the settler state understood: money. Direct action focused on strategic choke points and coordinated with the mass mobilization of solidarity rallies, which forced the Canadian government to negotiate with Indigenous land defenders on terms it normally wouldn't consider. But more importantly, the Indigenous land defenders' demands became more focused. It wasn't just about reconciliation or stopping a pipeline. People get confused about what we want as Native people, Denzel Sutherland Wilson of the Gitxsan Nation said, referring to the eviction of the Coastal GasLink Pipeline Company from the lands of the Wet'suwet'en Nation. He said, "It's like, what do you want? Just land back." The crux of the so-called Indian problem in the Western Hemisphere hinges on this question: what do Indians want? For us, it's a larger social problem of underdevelopment. Colonialism has deprived Indigenous people and all people who are affected by it the means to develop according to our needs, principles, and values. It begins with the land. We have been made Indians only because we have the most precious commodity to the settler state: land. Vigilante, cop, soldier often stand between us, our connections to the land and justice. Land back strikes fear into the heart of the settler. But as we show in the Red Deal, it's the soundest environmental policy for a planet teetering on the brink of total ecological collapse. The path forward is simple: decolonization or extinction. It begins with the land.
The settler is always white. The border town is always under attack. The native must always be destroyed. This is the recipe for an always present settler fear and anxiety, stoked by the terror of a coming great replacement fantasy or a white genocide in which Native and Black people are in constant rebellion, always threatening to do what the settler did first. To the settler, the only reasonable response to this is violence. Destroy the native before the native destroys you. Police are settler society's Indian killers. McClarty, Payne, and those Omaha cops killed Zachary Bare Heels for embodying this existential threat, as did Derek Chauvin. George Floyd is not the only man he killed. In 2016, Chauvin and the other police shot Wayne Reyes, a citizen of the Leak Lake Band of Ojibwe, 23 times, killing him. Police awarded Chauvin a Medal of Valor for his Indian killing, as they always do. Trace the work of the cop back in time. The first frontier police in the United States were the scalp hunters recruited into Indian country to murder Apaches in the 1840s and 1850s. And as Chairman Lopez pointed out, also in places like California. Chauvin and McClarty are the descendants, a product of a long line of scalp hunters, mutilators, and body part collectors. Churches in Santa Fe once ran the scalps of Apaches up their flagpoles. In Minnesota, settlers collected scalp bounties on Dakota men, women, and children. Frontier newspapers advertised land for sale alongside rewards for, quote, bloody red skins. The violence of the settler has always been understood as productive, progressive, and thus lawful. Police create order out of this imagined chaos. These scalp hunters never left. Instead, they exist alongside the police as de facto police. Settler citizenship entails a lethal obligation to kill Indians, and the history of settler colonialism is a history of the professionalization of this obligation. The settler hired the Indian killer to cleanse the land and to make way for white settlement. The settler got the world, the Indian got the reservation. It is from this history that the common American English idiom off the reservation comes to us with all its genocidal meaning. For the settler, the obligation to cleanse territory of any native presence and claim, it is the first premise of collective violence. From this premise comes perpetual violence, extermination, and the drive to erase all that is native. More dead Indians, more settler land. The Indian killer had counterparts in the East who were slave patrollers, hunting, capturing, and returning enslaved Africans to plantation overseers. But Native people and Black people are not hapless victims. There's a reason the thousands of protested there is a reason the thousands of protests that erupted following the George Floyd murder were described in mainstream media as a, quote, uprising. There is nothing that terrifies a settler more than the words Indian uprising or slave uprising. In fact, the founding document of the United States, the Declaration of Independence, mentions Native and Black people in the same paragraph, citing, quote, domestic slave rebellions and, quote, the merciless Indian savages as two major threats facing the nascent settler nation. These are our histories of resistance. Consider the Dakota Uprising of 1862, when the Dakotas, enraged by constant abuse at the hands of white settlers and broken treaties, burned down trade forts and attacked colonial settlements. Draw a straight line between the Dakota Uprising and the burning of the 3rd Precinct in Minneapolis. Connecting these two reminds us of our shared struggle, but it also reminds us to prepare for the backlash, because settler backlash always follows an uprising. The settlers imprisoned and hanged the Dakota Patriots in 1862 for their crime of wanting freedom. In 1863, a white settler captured and scalped the Dakota leader of the uprising, Taoyate Duta, also known as Little Crow. A mob dragged his body through the border town of Hutchinson, while white children exploded firecrackers in his nose and mouth. This is how they celebrated their 4th of July. Native activists founded the American Indian movement in Minneapolis in 1968, inspired by the Black Panther Party for self-defense. Like the Panthers, they came together to protect their relatives from police who constantly beat natives for being off the reservation. All law is settler law, so self-defense is always a crime when practiced by Native or Black people. Police and vigilantes killed AIM and Red Power activists as retribution. The FBI waged a terror campaign through its notorious COINTELPRO program. The settler is right to be afraid, because the Native is in fact coming for his fort. The Native does have plans to burn his police stations to the ground. A Native world will grow from the ashes of his settler world. A Native world is under constant erasure, but always on the verge of return. The settler is right to be afraid. Natives oppose the law precisely because they uphold a different kind of order, one that opposes the settler's commitment and obligation to collective violence. This is the settler past, present, and future, perpetual fear.
In this era of catastrophic climate change, why is it easier for some to imagine the end of fossil fuels, but not settler colonialism? To imagine green economies, carbon-free wind and solar energy and electric bullet train utopias, but not the return of indigenous lands? Why is it easier to imagine the end of the world, a zombie apocalypse or planetary catastrophe, but not the end of capitalism? In 2017, Tlingit scholar Ann Spice sat down with Unistoten hereditary spokesperson Frida Hewson for an interview that has since appeared in Standing with Standing Rock, Voices from the No Dapple Movement, an edited volume of over 40 contributors reflecting on the history and significance of the No Dapple uprising at Standing Rock in 2016. Spice's interview with Hewson was conducted in a log cabin that Hewson was asked to build in April 2010, 2 years after the Wet'suwet'en clans refused the British Columbia Treaty process requiring them to cede their ancestral lands to Canada. Midway through the interview, their conversation turns to the topic of critical infrastructure, a phrase that has been used repeatedly by the Canadian government to criminalize Wet'suwet'en people whose lands Canada claims to be in the way of lucrative oil and gas pipelines. In the interview, Spice asks, "I'm wondering how you think the way the industry approaches the land and the water and animals is different than the way you view those same things." Hewson replies, "Our critical infrastructure is the clean drinking water and the very water that the salmon spawn in. That salmon is our food source. It's our main staple food. That's one of our critical infrastructures. And there's berries that are our critical infrastructure, because the berries not only feed us, they also feed the bears. And the salmon also don't just feed us, they feed the bears. All of that is part of the system that our people depend on. And that whole cycle and system is our critical infrastructure. And that's what we're trying to protect in infrastructure that we depend on. The cabin in which Spice and Houston are talking is built in the exact area where TransCanada, Enbridge, and Pacific Trails want to lay oil and gas pipelines, the critical infrastructure that Canada has waged over a decade's worth of violent evictions, demolitions, surveillance, and harassment campaigns against Wet'suwet'en people to guarantee. Still, they will not leave the camp nor abandon their homes. The Unistoten, we are reminded, are fighting for the future health of the land. In addition to defining what critical infrastructure means for the Wet'suwet'en, Houston defines what it means for settler society and corporations in Canada. Quote, industry and government always talk about critical infrastructure, and their critical infrastructure is making money and using destructive projects to make that money, end quote. Houston's comments about critical infrastructure speak to the broader ethics and goals that drive the Red Deal's vision for economic and political change. A structural perspective rooted in Indigenous knowledge, particularly our traditions of science and technology, seeks to build critical infrastructures premised on methods of relationality that emphasize, above all else, caretaking and balance. This is crucial because the infrastructures we must dismantle are not only those that manifest in pipelines, bulldozers, smokestacks, dams, or man camps, the material infrastructure of extractivism. We must also undo the philosophy that drives these material conditions. As Houston notes, this philosophy is money, and its primary method of relationality is destruction. There's another word for a money-driven system that expresses its existence through destruction: capitalism. Capitalism destroys life. It pollutes rivers. It scars mountains. It starves the moose, wolves, and salmon. It alienates our bonds with each other and with the earth. Its very existence demands our disappearance. The Red Nation is serious about building alternatives to the death world of capitalism that we currently endure. We are serious because we know what is at stake if we do not. As we say early on in the Red Deal, we have two paths: decolonization or extinction. Like the Wet'suwet'en, we are Indigenous peoples who belong to and love our nations. Our sovereignty, our very being, cannot be separated from the health and well-being of the land. Like all societies and civilizations, our relationality and the values upon which these practices are based is what makes us who we are. Our political orders and systems of governance only matter if we caretake the land. They are intelligible through our relationship with the land, quite literally. It is for this reason that we cannot accept a path other than decolonization. As Sichangu Tintawan scholar Edward Valander argues about his own nation, the Ocheti Shakoi Oyate, quote, our sovereignty flows directly from our origin story. We must follow our instructions to be a good relative. This is precisely what our Wet'suwet'en relatives at Unistoten camp have shown us in their steadfast fight for the future health of the land. This is also what our Ocheti Shakoi relatives at Standing Rock did during the No Dapple movement, when they became water protectors to answer the call to help, to answer the call for help from their relatives of the Water Nation. Since water is our relative, we protect all our relatives from harm, says Walandra. Resisting Dapple was our response to a relative's call for help. Answering that call was and remains our responsibility. The critical infrastructure of Indigenous worlds is fundamentally about responsibility and being a good relative. But our responsibilities do not happen only in the realm of political transformation. Caretaking is the basis too for vibrant economies that must work fluidly with political structures to reinforce the world we seek to build beyond capitalism. We must thus have faith in our forms of Indigenous political economy, the critical infrastructures that Houston speaks of so eloquently. We must also be willing, as our fearless Wet'suwet'en relatives have done, to enforce these orders on a large scale. In conversation, Nick stated sometime a couple of years ago, I don't want to just honor the treaties, I want to enforce them. We can and should implement these programs in our own communities to alleviate suffering and protect what lands we are still able to caretake under colonial rule. To survive extinction, however, We must enforce Indigenous orders in and amongst those who have made it clear they will not stop their plunder until we are all dead. Settler and imperial nations, superpower militaries, multinational corporations, and members of the ruling class are enemies of the earth and the greatest danger to our future. How will we enforce Indigenous political, scientific, and economic orders to successfully prevent our mass ruin? This is the challenge we confront and pose in the Red Deal, and it is the challenge that all who take up the Red Deal must also confront. Thank you.
Thank you both so much. That was just an incredibly compelling and powerful presentation. Thank you. TJ, do you want to also come on? So I believe what we're going to do now is do, so sorry, TJ, what were you going to say?
I'm unable to start my video, so, oh, here we go. Okay, thank you. Yeah, I'm back. And thank you to Melanie and Nick. That was really just an amazing, comprehensive and totally justifiable condemnation of the death worlds of racial and colonial capitalism. And I think this is so poignant the way you put it, decolonization or extinction. That really is a powerful expression of truth telling. So thanks so much for sharing this with us. Sorry, Mayanthi, what were you saying?
No, I was just gonna say. So I think we're gonna move into a part of the evening where TJ and I will be in conversation with you and Nick, Melanie, and so we have a couple of questions prepared. I should also say that this would be the time for the audience. If you have questions, to start putting them in the Q&A. But TJ and I sort of figured we'd sort of start off the conversation, start off the dialogue. And I'm actually gonna, TJ, if you don't mind, I'll take the first question. I really appreciated the way, both of you wove together the stories of Zachary Bear Heels and George Floyd, right? The histories of slavery and its aftermath, and of genocide and dispossession of Native peoples, in order to fully articulate the nature of white supremacy and settler colonialism. So the Omaha cops and Derek Chauvin always together. And also importantly, I think the way that decolonization and abolition work and weave together. And speaking of these resonances, I actually went and looked it up while you were talking. I was reminded when you began of Christina Sharp's chapter, "The Weather," from In the Wake. I don't know if you know that, but I'm just gonna. So she writes in that chapter that the weather is the totality of our environments. The weather is the total climate, and that climate is anti-Black. And you would add, I imagine, anti-Indian. And she continues, the weather transforms Black being, but the shipped, the held, and those in the wake also produce out of the weather their own ecologies. And so I wanted to ask about what that work of decolonization and abolition always together looks like. And in some ways, this picks up on the conversation about solidarity across difference that came up yesterday in the cultural studies colloquium. And we spoke about the term, BIPOC, right? Black and Indigenous people of color, and the work it does both to bring together, but also to erase certain differences and certain histories and certain approaches. So here's the question. Could you talk a little bit about how the two of you are thinking through this question of, I would call it solidarity across difference, whether and how you work with non-Indigenous radical organizations, and especially Black radical and abolitionist organizations, and how you envision, and perhaps most importantly, how you envision what you call in the Red Deal a decolonized commons with these other folks, these other relatives.
I guess I'll just take a crack at it, first crack. Yeah, so the title, or like the phrase decolonization or extinction, I'll start there and then kind of weave into some of these other questions. It actually comes from, the kind of like communist slogan socialism or barbarism, right? And it's decolonization or extinction, kind of updating to understand that this, particular moment in time can't just be something like a kind of like, I think what a lot of people would assume like a quote unquote class war, right? Because I think a lot of people's understanding of classes isn't developed enough to understand the settler colonial situation specifically. And we understand classes about power, right? And that includes race, indigeneity, colonialism, etc. Things that are like easily left out of that equation, especially in the left in the United States. People don't think indigenous genocide is a form of class warfare, for example, and we would argue that it is. And therefore, decolonization and abolition are not mutually exclusive projects, nor so is Blackness and indigeneity. But I will say that unlike the kind of common understanding of, socialism and like building socialism in the United States, where it would be like, yeah, we're just going to eliminate class difference, which is, true. But one thing that's often forgotten is the fact that like, we're not trying to get rid of indigeneity or Blackness. But in fact, I think decolonization, as Melanie just read in the last, kind of part of the presentation, would be an amplification or a proliferation of indigeneity and Black life in the absence of a settler state, right? Or in the absence of what we now know as settler colonialism. And from what I understand from the traditions of abolition, like abolition democracy, to like Ruthie, which was something that Du Bois termed in Reconstruction, to abolition geography, is what Ruthie Gilmore talks about in this kind of day and age, is that it includes those kinds of things. And sometimes like decolonization and abolition are thought of in the negative, that they're just negating something, but in fact, they're actually proliferating something and amplifying something, right? I don't know if you want to jump in.
Yeah, I think that's a good place for me to jump in. The dual move of like negating settler ontology that we're clearly advocating for in both of these pieces, right? It's a dual move of negation, but also one of like profound, as Nick said, proliferation, but affirmation, and the affirmation of Indigenous and Black life. I think that decolonization and abolition speak to, and that the future-oriented kind of, so both decolonization and abolition are future-oriented projects, right? It's a dismantling of colonialism. It's a dismantling of carcerality, which is really central to settler colonialism. But it's also, right, an affirmation of life and a dreaming of a world otherwise that's premised on care. This thing we call relationality, it could kinship, it can have different words. Sometimes those things are appropriated within bizarre settler lexicons to, completely gut, actually, their origins. In Black and Indigenous traditions, I think of relationships with each other and with the land, and with our own histories. But this kind of caretaking that we're talking about in the Red Deal and really building on, I think comes out of both decolonial and abolitionist traditions, in that future-oriented project of like what that world looks like. And one other thing I wanted to say is that, we talked about this in that Communism is the Horizon piece that we published about 6 months ago as the Red Nation. We talk about property, right? Property, whiteness as property, and settler colonialism being fundamentally, right, about the transformation of one's relationship with land through alienation, which happens through property, and it happens through enclosure, right? The literal fences, the literal caging of land. And land isn't something that is separate from human beings. Like if you think about Indigenous knowledge and science, land is a literal relative and is referred to that way, for example, in the linguistic structures. And so land human relationality, right, there is not actually, it's a border, but it's not exactly separate. And so the enclosure of land that happens as a fundamental aspect of settler colonialism must actually be understood as a carceral relation, that property in and of itself requires the caging of relatives, right? Of animals as well, right? So it's not just like a human-centered kind of understanding of how carcerality operates. And so from a left or a socialist perspective, right, we talk a lot about the abolition of property. Like what would the abolition of property bring? What would it create? The possibilities, the conditions of possibility it would create, right, for different kinds of abolition geographies, right? these kind of configurations of freedom, the way that people would be able to relate to one another and to the land, you know, and to animal relatives in a fundamentally different way. And so if we understand property, right, as one of the, you know, the conversion of land and the conversion of people, the conversion of all life, frankly, into property, right, that is one of like the cornerstones of capitalism and settler colonialism, as well as racism, right, then I think we can start to trace backward and think about how Black and Indigenous traditions of decolonization, decolonizing the land, and then abolition, like freedom from carcerality, I think help us to imagine a different world, right? A different world where property is not the defining feature of how we relate to ourselves and to each other.
Thanks, Melanie. And that really, it provides a great lead into the next question, which I want to set up with some other remarks though. I just wanted to highlight this idea that you both put forward, especially in Nick's part of the presentation about the border town and how that's shifting your with all the Fanonian resonances that term carries, especially in your articulation of it. But there's also an important shift from the border as a nation state border to the border as a capitalist property-based border, which we find everywhere. And I thought that was really powerful to understand borders, not only geographically, but also economically, technologically, informationally, in relation to medicine and bodies, sociopolitically. And that seems to just be a really powerful way to develop a critique of what you're calling settler ontology in all of its power. I want to move to the way you're also bringing this around to Indigenous liberation and resistance, connecting with all of these struggles that are going on right now. And specifically in relationship to the essay that you just mentioned, Melanie, Communism is the Horizon, Queer Indigenous Feminism is the Way, which is on the website of Red Nation. I encourage everyone to check this out, and you can freely download this and read it. It's really a compelling approach. In there, you write that communism is our past and our horizon. Indigenous people have always been communists. And further, you write, we love communism because we love ourselves. When we speak of Indigenous communism, we speak of caretaking and liberation. We speak of a world based on social well-being and abundance, where all relatives have their needs met and live with dignity and joy, where social relations are based on cooperation, reciprocity, consent, mutual respect, support, and care, and other than human relatives have equal standing with human beings. This is a world of self-determination, autonomy, and the agency of all life to live free from violence and coercion, specifically carcerality. A world where equality abounds and class disappears. A world filled with creativity and happiness. That's the end of that passage. And forgive me for quoting that at length, but I think it's so amazing. And it's a beautiful world that you're describing and that you're struggling for, and one that I also would want to live in. So I think, and I know Mayanthi has some additional, kind of different approach to this question. Maybe I'll turn to her after I finish my question. But I just wanted to ask you to talk more about this. And I want to connect it to something else that you say in the Red Deal, in just a short quote, where you say that the Red Deal is red because it prioritizes Indigenous liberation on the one hand and a revolutionary left position on the other. And then importantly, you say it's simultaneously particular and universal because Indigenous liberation is for everybody. And I think it's so powerful and a generative opening to possibilities for solidarity across difference, which we've been talking a little bit about and connects to the cultural studies presentation of Melanie and others yesterday. So maybe, we know, however, at the same time that universality, this term is a really difficult one for many people who see it as as a way of reasserting a kind of Euro-American imperialism within that guise of universality. So I'm wondering if you can talk about that as well as Indigenous communism. And maybe Mayanthi wants to add on to this quickly.
Yeah, I mean, I struggle with the notion of the universal term, right? And so I did want to hear, and I know that you, Melanie, you and Nick have thought about this a lot. And so I kind of, in some ways, maybe want you to walk me and us a little bit through your thinking about the let me phrase it slightly differently. So the Red Deal really has an interesting way of connecting the Marxist critique of private property with indigenous communal landholding, right? But I was curious, I guess, about why the turn to the term communism rather than staying with a more an indigenous term or a Lakota term or a Diné term. Why the translation of indigenous life worlds into the framework of communism? And so my question is not so much this is just, you know, your imperialism in the guise of something else, but rather I'm because I struggle with this question of translation in some sense, right? And how to maintain the singularity of certain ethical and political traditions, especially non-Western traditions, without always having to translate. And then when we do the work of translation, why that term always ends up being one that has a Euro-American history. So this is, I mean, I'm not, this is in some ways not really a criticism. I'm asking you to, because I struggle with this. I struggle with this question. And so, yeah, so I know you must have as well. And so I'm curious about how you got to this point.
Sure. I'll start with Mayanthi's question and partially answer TJ's. I'm sure Melanie can answer it better.
We'll build it together.
Yeah. I think, like, I would say that actually, I would say that, like, communism has been developed and theorized better outside of Europe than it has been. I would actually consider this Europe too. Like, the United States thinks it's Europe. I mean, let's just be honest. Like everything, all the traditions, all the political traditions, there's nothing that's indigenous from this land. There's nothing that actually reflects the reality of the centuries and, you know, if not millennia of history that existed here prior to and exists alongside of these settler nations. The other thing is that, like, I would say that, like, communism, like, for indigenous people, actually proves that capitalism was neither inevitable nor is it natural, right? Because we lived in non-capitalist societies. They weren't perfect, they weren't utopic, nothing is, but nonetheless, we are actually proof that capitalism isn't an inevitable or natural system. And I think there's a universal notion to that, right? And I'm not trying to, like, I know that there's been, like, weird anthropology around that and stuff, and I'm not an anthropologist, so I'm not referencing any of that, just to get that out there. This is just based on my own, like, a study of history and even understanding our transition from indigenous, you know, people who are living a non-capitalist way of life to one that is, you know, capitalist. But we didn't, like, even though they destroyed a non-capitalist mode of production, right, the economic base, to get really Marxian, people will probably get really pissed off about this. I don't really care. But our non-capitalist way of life, living with the land, you know, and not just, like, we were killing things, we were messing it up, we fucked up a lot. You know, there's stories in our own tradition about, like, how we killed too many buffalo at one point in time, how we treated women, how we treated you know, binary people. There were all those stories in there. We were like any other society, and we dealt with it the way that we did in the best way that we could, and, like, tried to enter back into correct relations. That entire world, that economic base that fed us, like the actual material things that we used to construct that world, was completely taken from us, right? Whether it's through our relations to the non-human world, like the Buffalo Nation, as Melanie mentioned earlier, or through our connection to other relatives, like the water. Can't even drink water, you know, out of our rivers anymore. And so what happened is that economic mode turned into one of extractive capitalism, and capitalism in particular. But we retained the culture of a non-capitalist way of living, and you can see the remnants of that in a lot of our communal kind of, like, ways of living, right? And so why wouldn't you focus on the actual seed of something that like cultures that have lived without capitalism for millennia as the basis for a non-capitalist society in the future, right? It doesn't make sense to like try to invent whatever Irish or Scandinavian, you know, like lutefisk, whatever they're doing, I don't know. That doesn't make sense in this context, right? And so I think, you know, Mayanthi was a Peruvian Marxist who actually believed in like a heroic creation, one that wasn't just a, you know, a strict copy of somewhere else and placed upon it, but one that actually was like rooted in the real lived experiences and the cultural knowledge of people. And so I would say indigenous people, indigenous knowledge, it's not this kind of like, when you say that, like, because of Eurocentric racism, people just hear flute music, right? They're like, oh, you guys are related to buffaloes? They're like, oh, cool. Yeah, can you sing a song for me? They're used to us performing that. I love our music, no offense to our musicians, but that's what tends to happen, right? We become anthropological subjects and we become a particular, right? Oh, that's nice. We brought the indigenous people, you know, it's like Biden's ceremony. It's like, you know, like his inauguration ceremony is like case in point. It's like headline news in native country. It's Biden recognized us, you know, like, and everyone's like freaking out. But that also gets to another point, is that like liberal democracy is about homogeneity. It's about a rights-bearing individual. It doesn't recognize the plurality, the complex relations, not only between human civilizations and groups, but also non-human civilizations and groups, right? So our current constitutional framework is so funny in the United States. It's the most like, it's the worst constitution in the world. And there's a cult, there's a religious cult around it. Like you see, not just like, we can look at the right wingers, but actually there's liberals. Like if you saw that, like, you know, people were crying, you know, all these things that were happening, there's such an emotional investment in it. But that Constitution itself was premised on indigenous erasure and the creation of rights-bearing citizens to be assimilated in it. But the fact of the matter is there actually are models out there that suggest that we could have a multinational, not a cultural, a multinational or plural national model that recognizes that we aren't, as civilizations or groups of people, equal, but nonetheless we come into, you know, our interaction with the colonial project as collective groups of people, as indigenous, as Black, even migrants to some extent. So there is this kind of challenge to the liberal democratic order, because it requires us to forego our indigenous governance systems. It's not recognized, right? We can even look at the 6 Congress people who are in office right now, 3 of whom are like right-wing Republicans. One of them was like, you know, he actually said, these are really good guys. That's what he said to the guys who stormed the Capitol, right? He's a Native guy, right? And we have to participate in one vote, you know, one vote kind of democracy. And we don't have representation as actual nations in liberal democracy in this current moment. And I think, you know, that's what we're actually saying when we're saying like our understanding of the vast diversity of human, you know, humanity in general, but also the non-human world is actually much more generous and capacious than what's currently on offer, right? And that just doesn't really get translated into like liberal democratic norms or, you know, what's currently on offer. And I'll turn it over to Melanie because I've spoken too much.
Yeah, I think, you know, your question, I think you're both kind of working with this notion of the universal, right? There's a suspicion of the universal that I find very interesting. It's a productive suspicion. But you know, something else we say in that piece is that we actually reclaim communism for its rightful place because it actually comes from us, right? It comes from this hemisphere, even the way that is tracked through by Marx himself and within Marxist traditions. And so for us, it's like communism is the origin story, you know, for us, like what we actually mean when we're describing that. And we're not necessarily talking about, you know, like nation state formations that have adopted communism in a particular way in history. And so that's partly the reason why we reclaim it. And I think that that's one of the reasons, right, why we use the term. We're actually literally just kind of giving the middle finger, actually, to the Eurocentric understanding of what communism is, because most of the settler left in the United States is still incredibly anti-Indian. Let's just be honest. Like decolonization and indigenous self-determination is routed through some of the most bizarre, arcane notions like Leninist self-determination and things like that, in a way that like fundamentally misunderstands how capitalism operates in a settler society like the United States. So there's that going on too. But something that I've learned a lot from doing left internationalism, kind of like the kind that had emerged, you know, in the post-war era, you know, around the time that neoliberalism was really taking hold globally, you know, from the third world, from the global south, from the darker nations, as Nick said, they do communism better, you know, than anything that we may have seen coming out of Europe. But that there's something about socialism that provides a common grammar across difference that is so powerful. You know, I could never expect, or I think it would be weird, right? Me as like a Navajo person to go talk to like someone in Mas in Bolivia and be like, hey, like we do this thing with corn, and, you know, to have a very, very particular, right, understanding of social relations through my own relationship with indigeneity. Like indigeneity isn't universal, it's particular. Like our languages don't even translate, right? And so I think it's trying to, from an indigenous perspective, trying to find a way to engage with other indigenous people throughout the world and other oppressed nationalities, essentially, using a common grammar that is, you know, complicated history, but actually has been like tested through real revolutions. Like we've never had a real revolution here, at least for indigenous people. And so trying to find something that, you know, other oppressed people and other specifically colonized people, they're colonized people who have actually waged successful decolonization struggles using socialism in part, not in full, right, as a tool for doing that, I think is something that we absolutely should never turn away from, you know, as indigenous people who are living under a colonial condition today. And also, I'm just gonna, you know, let's just be honest, like anyone born in the United States is just gonna be born into like anti-communist hegemony. Let's just be honest. I mean, this is like anti-communism is like as American as apple pie in the United States. And so the hesitancy and the suspicion people have, even of that word, fully aligns with the project of US settler colonialism, you know, and like the massive work that the United States had to do in the latter part of the 20th century to destroy communism. And especially when it was related, I mean, of course, to the Soviet Union, but also to the national liberation struggles in the third world and the global south against imperialism. And so the question of US imperialism, right, is also very central when we're thinking about communism. Because the moment you say that, you know, the moment you say that in the United States, like everyone gets uncomfortable and they're like, what, we're gonna actually have to question imperialism and settler colonialism. And then like the profound discomfort and nervousness comes out. And so it's also partly to, you know, just like take a stand against that, which happens in our own communities, but it's also just hegemonic, right? Anti-communism is hegemonic. And we learn, not just as Marxists, but literally everyone in graduate school who engages in like, you know, post-structural theory, which is pretty much everybody probably at UC Santa Cruz, for example, knows that when anything is hegemonic, it must be questioned and challenged. That's literally your job, right? As somebody who has, I think, a conscience, like an ethical approach. And so that's the other thing that I would say. And you know what Nick said about like the remnants, like the cultural traditions of indigenous people, I just said that they're very particular, right? Like I, as a Navajo person, would never expect to apply something very particular, like a Navajo form of governance to the world's population. That's a very bizarre, I think, approach to universalism. But nevertheless, I think that the tenets of indigenous knowledge, as he said, it has universal application, and that it is okay to think about hegemony in relationship to counter hegemony. Like there is a war of ideas going on. There's a war of hegemonies. And you know what? The hegemony I want is a hegemony where like the human, the notion of the liberal human isn't premised on Black and Native death. Wouldn't that be a great hegemony to live in, right? A world that's actually structured, a universal premise, right? Where like we're not just like killing like racialized people in the world in order to build an empire. That's, you know, like that's a universal I can get on board with. And so I know that those are things that probably make people really uncomfortable, but that's partly the reason why we use that language and sort of why we're pushing the boundaries. I think of these things that actually make people pretty uncomfortable.
I think it's really important, and I think it's compelling as well. Especially as we're living in this period where we're witnessing perhaps the restoration of a kind of neoliberal multicultural reformism, perhaps with the Biden administration, and also in the prevalent kind of culture of academia, which is endlessly criticizing things, and in some ways, and at sometimes unable to come out with like bold, courageous statements or engaging language that is maybe historically questionable for some reasons, but giving it up is profoundly debilitating at the same time. So I think that's really important. So I love that you do that and I think it's so refreshing and also politically enabling. But I want to bring in a couple audience questions at this point. Lindsay Tavares Sabito asks, in your opinion, how can we move closer to making our own liberated futures as we continue to navigate our present conditions that are deeply entrenched in white supremacy and racial capitalism? And then also Raquel Trinidad asks, what do you think are some lessons? Maybe you could talk a little bit about practice and a bit more specificity. Although I think you've really covered this well, but what are some specific lessons learned from the Bolivarian plurinational government project for our own USA context? So those are two questions we could start with.
Well, since Melanie's still writing, I'll try not to be the dude guy that's going first all the time, but I'll try to keep my answers short. I think the first question, or something that you said, TJ, that I was thinking about, I study social movements, and I think I treat social movements as legitimate sites of knowledge production, as I'm sure a lot of people do. And I also write to them as well, and produce work that I feel like is relevant. I think there is sometimes an expectation to produce questions or critique and not provide solutions. I think there's a hesitancy to that, but I do think there's an urgency in this moment to speak to those kinds of things, and I think that's a totally legitimate form of academia or academic knowledge production, and that we should encourage students to actually do that and do social movement work. Some people call it like scholar activism. I don't like the word activism because I don't consider myself an activist. But that's another story. And then as far as alternatives, somebody, brought this up, I think, again, settler colonialism and the kind of the cunning of this current liberal democratic process has really co-opted any alternative. It's made itself the only alternative. Look at the choice between Biden and Trump. If you really break it down, politically, there's not a lot of difference in the outcomes for the rest of the world, right? Maybe some, here and there we'll get a less racist president, even though he's gave a eulogy at Strom Thurmond's funeral, even though he's an ardent, he was at one point in time an ardent segregationist, but all can be forgiven, right? In this new neoliberal order. But it's interesting to me how we can recuperate the dead corpse of neoliberal multiculturalism, right? And this is the new, literally polishing, a turd, basically. It's this is the only option that we can come up with when all the polling, even the scientific data, if you believe the polling, whatever, suggests that most Americans, especially working class Americans in this country, are far to the left of what anything Biden is capable of doing. And he's literally he's just using plastic surgery to kind of, change the face of this particular administration, right? I don't even know if Trump has ever had plastic surgery. I just thought about that. I bet Biden has, but I don't think Trump has. Biden looks like he's had plastic surgery. And that's nothing against plastic surgery. I'm just saying that. I might be a little off in there. But what other lessons, from the plurinational models? It's important to remember that these things are still under struggle right now. Guatemala just had this, they had their own storming of the Capitol, but for good reasons, right? They were actually trying to push a plurinational constitution to just get it voted on. They want that kind of democracy, but the boot of US imperialism prevents, literally is holding back that process, right? It wasn't even like what news coverage it got didn't even mention the fact that this is something that Indigenous people have been pushing for decades, like at least since like the 80s, right? And the same thing happened in Honduras with the US backed coup that happened, you know, under Obama State Department with Hillary Clinton. They just, all they wanted is they wanted Zelaya, they wanted Zelaya to like do a popular referendum where they would vote on whether or not they should rewrite the Constitution. There was massive popular support for a plurinational model based on Bolivia and somewhat on Venezuela, right? So this has a lot of support in certain sectors, right? In Ecuador, you know, it depends on the, you know, the who's in power, it depends on, you know, a lot of kind of factors, but it's like a baseline, right, in many ways. And so these things you can't just like write something into law and then expect it to like work out magically. These things come through struggle, right? And it's going to take a lot of struggle to get to that kind of point in this country. And I'll say that there has been precedent, you know, the Trail of Broken Treaties in 1972, which was actually written by Hank Adams, who passed away last month in December. Nobody even knows who Hank Adams is, and you should know who Hank Adams is. He wrote one of the most foundational movement documents that actually became the outline for the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. But what he actually advocated for was creating a different kind of constitutional model in the United States that would create like a treaty commission that would represent, a federal commission that would represent Indigenous people and give them like federal power, right? Obviously, you know, this was under Nixon, or this was like around the election time, and nothing really came of it, but it did become like an international model that a lot of Indigenous movements, you know, like look to. And I think that it's possible, like maybe, I don't know about like the flag waving stuff. There's a lot of people who are invested in the settler state and, you know, the settler government. But I think that we actually have to like have bold kind of like ideas and imaginations. And like we have to have bold plans that kind of exist outside of the two-party structure right now. That's the only way I could say. And like I would just encourage people to join an organization, join DSA, join whatever, you know, organization that is near your place. Get involved in something beyond just the academy. You know, as the heroic freedom fighter Larry Casus once said, who was actually killed by the police, he said, "Don't just talk about it, you know, you have to actually do something about it." And it may sound simple, but it's actually true. It's actually very true. And, you know, he gave his life for that cause. And I think that's something that we should really deeply consider, you know, as not just academics, but as students, as people who, you know, are like, want to see change in the world. Like everyone has, you know, like a good heart, in my opinion, or at least not everyone, but
That's not true.
Cheney doesn't even have a heart. I'll stop myself there before I say
Don't go
anything
there.
else.
That's not true.
But I do think that there needs to be a way to effectively channel that into like some kind of organized structure. And I think that begins by engaging community organizing and doing the best that you can with the resources that you have, especially if you're attached to the university.
Yeah, I'm just gonna echo everything Nick said. Join an organization right now, whether it's DSA, which is the largest force right now that we have in the United States. If you're Indigenous and you're listening to this, hit us up, see if the Red Nation is something that might work for you. You know, we had a podcast episode, the Settlers Gone Wild podcast episode that came out last week about the Capitol Hill nonsense on January 6th. And, you know, Nick said in that, we kind of ended off saying like, if you're not organizing, you're not doing enough. And that's not like a condemnation, right, of anyone. We're not trying to make anyone feel like they're inadequate. But in this, I mean, the truth, right? So you have Trump kind of speculating about starting the Patriot Party, basically the fascist party, like the break off from the Republican Party. And it's like, God damn it, why haven't we figured out how to do that on the left? Like the right has actually outpaced us significantly. You know, they can storm Capitol Hill with very little repercussions. They've made it into the ranks of the Republican Party. And now they might just become like a full fascist party that's really going to give us a run for our money, you know, in the coming years. And it's not to say necessarily that the left needs to form a party. Maybe we do. That might be the proper vehicle or instrument, right? As Moss says, an instrument for kind of developing struggle. I'm not really sure if it is. But we need to do something really concrete at a scale that's actually going to tip the scales in terms of power. And that's just organization. There's got to be organization involved in it. There's like there's power in people's movements, and like the organic uprisings we see, like the burning down of police stations, or just like the things that pop off in Indian country against resource extraction. There's a power that those uprisings have that cannot be denied and that must be always supported, right? There also needs to be organization involved, I think, in combination with that. And there needs to be a vision at a scale that goes beyond the particular. It just does, right? I mean, like the right has far outpaced us in this regard. They figured out their universals a while ago. It's QAnon, which is like, everyone's just like, how the hell did this become like a thing that all of the like millions of people believe in? But it did. It was hella successful, right? And so like, what are we gonna do to build something that is equally compelling and persuasive, you know, for working class people, for like poor people, most of whom are people of color, and like migrant workers, you know, and indigenous caretakers, and like Black workers in this country, and women, right? And so it's just not gonna fall out of the sky. We actually have to build it. And there is some urgency. I feel some urgency in needing to build it. And I think the organizations that exist right now that believe in organization and are really trying to think through the scale at which we need to level up, you should join those organizations or like support them or do something, whatever you can, because like that's just what we got to do.
Yeah, and Chairman Lopez earlier actually pointed out like things that need to be done locally for those who are listening in the Santa Cruz area on the Lonely Land.
And so actually there's another question from Will Parrish, precisely about kind of California, you know, kind of local actions, right? And so they write, would you describe your view of how universities such as the University of California are materially implicated in settler colonialism? I'm thinking of the University of California's status as a land grant university, and also how the UC is arguably the main driving force behind the 30-meter telescope project on Mauna Kea. Part of my inspiration for asking this question is that Mauna Kea, Kiai, and students are currently working together across UC campuses for University of California divestment from the TMT project.
Yeah. Will, hey Will. Will's
Will.
as tall as me, by the way. I'm like really tall, and like Will's like, we see eye to eye.
Oh my God, classic dad joke.
Yeah, sorry. I think like, you know, I think one thing that's troubled me about not like my discipline, but the humanities, there tends to be a critique of like the humanities as like these carceral institutions, like you know, taking Foucault to this extreme place to say everything is a prison. And it's like, no, that's not true. Like I work at a university that develops like nuclear bombs, right? That trains border patrol, that has like is deeply imbricated in the military industrial complex. Like, and we're like fighting for scraps at the humanities table over like really, I think, meaningless things when it comes to the long-term, you know, long view of it. And actually I'm really excited that you know, Will brought that up, and I, you know, commend, you know, not only the working on the 30-meter telescope, but also the grad student organizing that's happened at especially at UC Santa Cruz. Like kudos to you all. Like that's inspirational, man. That's like that we weren't able to do that when I was in grad school, you know, and it's important. And I, you know, I think it's important to recognize that a lot of students sacrifice their education to ensure, you know, gains that they won't even be able to benefit from in their time. And that's the kind of work that it requires, you know, and I think unions are a good place to start. I work with several unions. I just talk to people. I just talk to workers like about like decolonization, and not in an academic way, but in ways that connect, you know, to understand that like it may not apply to their direct kind of like line of work or like what they're doing on the shop floor, but at least they know and they understand that this is like union organizing can be used for decolonization, right? And that if they understand these histories, you know, that they as a worker, somebody who's been denied that education and denied that, you know, that historical experience, but it feels very compelled to do something about it. That's important. Look, working at universities is, you know, is the exact same way. Like they have so many resources. Like the University of Minnesota is actually like, has like colonized, like literally only exists because of the dispossession and genocide of my people, right? And universities do actually possess land that they could give back as well. I don't really know any universities, public universities like Cornell, which is like the major offender, that are actually giving land back or wealth back to Indigenous people. But those are easy campaigns to kind of like, to get on board, because a lot of times universities right now, all of their spending is in STEM, and that STEM technology, or the STEM programs, are all invested in like weapons contracting, weapons manufacturing, defense industries. Here it's border patrol and police.
Security.
Yeah, and so it makes it easier because they're all in like one place and they're all getting the same money. The CIA is on campus here too. They're everywhere. My office is probably bugged. I don't know.
Yeah, you all should check out. I think it came out in October of 2020. I'm assuming what Will is referencing is a High Country News article called Land Grab University. It was a very comprehensive investigative piece on land grant universities and the very strong history, right, that universities, colleges and universities in the United States have of like literally benefiting from stolen and dispossessed Indigenous land. I'm sure Land Back is going to target universities at a place near you so you can participate in some of those campaigns. But it's also important to think that the university, there's a reason why the right has like attacked universities over the last couple of years. You know, the assault on Jill Biden for being a doctor. She's like a fake doctor. I don't know if you remember like the whole kind of right-wing assault on cancel culture that happened and in right-wing media and on Twitter where, you know, people were talking about canceling Yale. Do you guys remember these things? I mean, yeah, we should cancel Yale. I'd actually be totally down with that project. But the impetus for that, right, was to gut the intellectual work and the spaces like classrooms where the kinds of politics are shared in places like my department, like Native American Studies or American Studies, right? It was to insinuate that these are like breeding grounds for commies, right? And things like that. And so the right has its sights set on destroying these kinds of spaces in universities, right? And so universities are a battleground. They're like literally a space, a field of struggle that we must engage in. We just can't turn away from them. And also student organizing historically in the United States, student organizing has absolutely changed history for people. It has improved the conditions of lives for people. Like you cannot, like Kiva Club, which is this Native student organization at UNM, was one of the most important organizations for the inception of Red Power in the 1970s, that then became the American Indian movement, the legacy of which we continue forward today as the Red Nation. I'm on the board of the National Student for Justice in Palestine organization, right, which is based on university campuses. The Palestine Solidarity Movement would not be where it is today in the United States had it not been for student organizing. So yes, universities like are gross imperialist, colonial capitalist institutions, but they are also fields of struggle that we should not relinquish and just shouldn't give an inch in these spaces, those of us who are inside of these institutions.
And just to add to that, it's like we have every right to be here.
Yep.
And we shouldn't cede that ground to the right. And we should fight for these spaces, even though they're small spaces and underfunded, but we shouldn't cede that ground to the right. Shouldn't cede the ground, like it's a battle of ideas, like as Fidel Castro said during, the special period in the 90s after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Like we can't just cede ground, like intellectual knowledge, production, like we can't just cede that ground to the right and be like, oh, we're going to go for a more pure version, right? But also at the same time, it's understanding that the university is part of this apparatus, and I don't know if you can really decolonize the university. I don't know if that's a project because it was like fundamentally founded. It's like saying like I want to decolonize Congress. I was like, oh, good luck, cool. I don't know how that's going to turn out. Yeah, but it doesn't mean that we cede ground. The university is a workspace just like anywhere else, and we should organize and we should treat it that way because we are
give ourselves workers. That's also an important transition possibly for some people. Yeah.
So that's all I would say.
Thanks so much for all of that. And the shout out to the UCSC COLA Wildcat Strikers, the cost of living adjustment. This is indeed has been really important as a wedge that is building power against the continued onslaught and neoliberalization of the university, especially at the University of California. And also to speaking about internationalism, which Melanie just brought up in terms of Palestinian struggles, and the general imperative of movement building and organizing. All that stuff is so important. We don't really have time to go into everything. I have so many questions. I would like to ask one last one, if you both are okay with time. And that is, it's a difficult question about movement organizing and the struggle ahead. And what do you think, how should we relate to or think about the 74 million people who voted for Trump in the last election, more than in the previous one, right? Are they simply irredeemable? Are they just misguided QAnons and MAGA reactionaries and settler white supremacists and neo-Nazis? And I'm sure at least, many of them or some of them definitely are. Or is that a potentially, if we dismiss that multitude, is that a strategic error? Is there any potential shared ground with some, even if it's incommensurable, and a transformative potential in the ongoing experience of racial and colonial capitalism and impoverishment and inequality that has led to this growing immiseration and organized abandonment and mass indebtedness and COVID loss and evictions and what you both are talking about in terms of border town violence and its generalization, for which we can anticipate that the Biden administration, even though we might have some hopes, may offer way too little in the way of any kind of meaningful transformation. So is there organizing potential here for a multiracial working class struggle in terms of thinking about this category? What do you think about this? And it's fine if you think that that's a bad question as well, but it's a challenging one that I'm thinking about as part of a movement as well with DSA. So what do you think?
I guess I'm going first again, since Melanie is not. I think it's a good question because I would say that I think that the left completely underestimates the right. And
Yeah.
it's easy to make fun of the people who stormed the Capitol, and it's easy to laugh, and it's easy to poke fun, but they're true believers in this, and that's a very potent ideology, to bring people to that point, And I would say that it's very organized. I'm not saying that it's decentralized. I'm in the camp that says it's very organized. I just downloaded Telegram. You should check it out and just you join all the Proud Boy groups and see what they're saying. There's thousands of people in these chats, and they're organizing and they're coordinating fascist actions, and they have a very coherent ideology for fascists about what they're actually trying to accomplish. And so in that sense, I think we would be doing a disservice to underestimate that potential. And that's, obviously the 74 million people are different. They're not all the same. They didn't have all the same reasons for voting for Trump. But also Trump actually, we can hate him. We can see through the BS and the race mongering and that he's doing and all the things that he's doing, but he's actually providing an alternative, whether we like that or not. Biden isn't providing. Biden's weird because he's the Make America Great Again guy. His America is back. It's the worst buff of MAGA. At least MAGA had history with Reagan, right? America is back. I don't know. It's where did it go? It's taking a nap, eating milk and cookies. I don't know. But he, and also you can see the demographic shifts within the Trump, the vast majority of Trump voters, the highest vote was upper middle class white men, right? Upper middle class white men. But also there was some people, I think there isn't a liberal elite that has a smugness around this that I also think is also incredibly dangerous as well, that we shouldn't just be oh, we all agree that Trump is so bad, right? Because it allows for allows for Biden to continue the foreign policy of Trump, right? It's now, instead of just bombs with MAGA on it, it's bombs with intersectionality on it or whatever. I don't know what he's doing. There was a new State Department order that actually they said it's now okay for U.S. embassies to fly the pride flag, right? as if like that's the big foreign, like that's a big foreign policy achievement. It's like, as we know, historically, U.S. embassies have served as a hotbed for regime change in other countries. So I think that we have, like, I take the approach of, it's not so much we write off 74 million people as like, I don't believe in original sin, but I think that we don't. There's also a large section of the population that didn't vote either, you know, and nobody's speaking to them. Not even the Trump or the fascists or even the liberals are speaking to them. And to me, like, I know a lot of my family falls in that. They just don't care. They don't care about Trump. They think Biden is just like some kind of like bad retro 80s thing, you know, like, why are they bringing this back? You know, why are they redoing Point Break? You know, why are they doing Wonder Woman 84? What is, you know, whatever it is. And I think that that's actually a legitimate critique and a legitimate form of politics that we don't speak to. I don't know what's going to happen with the, you know, the 74 million Trump voters. I don't even know what's happened to all the children and the descendants of the Klan people, because like there was millions of them at one point in time too. That was a whole thing, you know. There's millions of people in this country, white people specifically, are the descendants and direct beneficiaries of the Homestead Act, right? We aren't responsible for the past, but we inherit the present, right? That is completely structured by that past, and like how we go forward from there is a question for everyone. I obviously not going to align with fascists, but I think we need to reform the question beyond the binary of who voted for Trump and who voted for Biden, because some of the people who voted for Biden are very awful people too.
Yeah, I'm not going to add too much to that. I think I echo everything Nick said, but I will kind of reiterate and double down on providing an alternative. Again, I actually haven't looked at the stats, like the data on the breakdown, like the demographic breakdown of Trump supporters. I do know that like the most fascist elements are petty bourgeois white folks. And so they're hopeless, you know, they're just, you know, they're in their own space. There's no point, they're actually enemies of what we're trying to construct. And so I think it's okay to just understand them as such. But I would say probably folks who are working class or poor who voted for Trump, those of us who claim to be like, you know, wanting to work with the working class, you know, socialists, particularly talk a lot about, you know, working class mobilization and building up the proletariat. We haven't done that, you know, otherwise we would not be facing the things that we're facing in this country. And so I think there's incredible support for Bernie still and what Bernie represented. I think there is incredible support for DSA. The left gets caught in a lot of really dumb shit. Unfortunately, we are engaged in like intra-left, like infighting all the time. I think there's like these weird things that happen around identity politics that hold us back. And I think that we have like, you know, work to do, and it would be nice if we did it in a timely way to get our act together so that we could provide a really compelling alternative for folks. And, you know, the people who don't vote, like Nick said, his own family, they're mostly just, that's a protest. That's like I don't want to have anything to do with this system. I mean, we could provide an alternative, you know, that might be compelling for those folks in a way that could really shift things if we're interested in engaging electoral politics, for example, as a field of struggle. Some people are, some people aren't. But yeah, I'm not quite sure. That's not something I've thought entirely through, or the Red Nation has thought entirely through.
Yeah, I think, you know, trying to transform material conditions like Medicare for all.
Yes,
Wouldn't that be a good start if we're trying
yeah,
to?
it sure would.
Yeah, to win hearts and minds,
Yep.
to
Absolutely.
you know, a transformative future of justice and ecological flourishing for all. Melanie and Nick, I want to thank you for, you know, your time and your work and your contributions. It's been amazing. Great to hear from you. It's so inspiring. Thank you so much for sharing this with us. And I look forward to, you know, following your ongoing work with the podcast and Red Nation. I hope it will grow and thrive and continue to internationalize. So thank you again for participating.
Yeah, thank you for this incredible conversation. It's just so the depth of what you do, but also the pragmatism is what I really appreciate, the sort of combination of the two. So thank you. And thank you for taking the time tonight.
Thanks for having us. Thank you again,
Thank you for
Chairman
having us.
Lopez.
Yeah,
Those
and thank
powerful
you.
words.
Yes, thank you, Chairman Lopez.
Yeah, thank you to Chairman Lopez and everyone for tuning in. Hope to see you next time.
You're welcome. Thank you. Good night.
So,
Thank
go
you,
on it.
everybody.
Bye.
Get to come inside with.
Mm.